All right, let's kick things off with a bit of a brain teaser. Imagine five frogs just chilling on a log, right? Four of them decide, hey, we're going to jump off. So how many frogs are left on the log?
Hmm. Well, still five, right? Deciding to jump and actually jumping are two very different things.
Exactly. And that's precisely the kind of conundrum we're diving into today. Why is it that even the best laid plans, the most brilliant strategies, often don't quite translate into real world results? Today, we're focusing on the realm of risk management, and we've got some seriously insightful material that really gets to the core of this.
Absolutely. We've been looking at some sources that highlight this common pitfall. It's not necessarily the initial risk assessment or the planning phase that trips people up. It's that crucial leap to actually taking action. But here's the really interesting part. We're not just going to diagnose the problem. We're going to unpack 4 practical steps to actually bridge that gap, to move from deciding to doing. And when you think about it, that ability to proactively shape outcomes, even when things are uncertain, that's invaluable, whether you're tackling a complex project, navigating business challenges, or even pursuing personal goals.
You're so right. Uncertainty is the one constant, isn't it? So the big question we're grappling with today is, how do we actually move from deciding what to do about risks to actually doing it? How do we get those metaphorical frogs to finally take the plunge? And our source material really boils it down to 4 key actions: agreed ownership, realistic resources, integration into your main plan, and active monitoring. Those are the insights we'll be unpacking today.
Let's dive into that deciding versus doing gap. It's fascinating. Our sources point out that the hardest part of risk management isn't usually all the upfront work, all the planning, the analysis, figuring out what should happen. Where things really tend to break down is in that transition from those well-intentioned strategies to actually seeing concrete actions on the ground.
It almost seems counterintuitive, right? You'd think the heavy lifting would be in the initial thinking, the risk identification, those complex assessments. But what we're seeing is that while most organizations can come up with a pretty comprehensive list of potential problems, that's often where the momentum stalls. We're good at spotting what might go wrong.
Exactly. We invest all this energy in brainstorming, analyzing, strategizing, creating these elaborate response plans for every imaginable risk. And look, all that upfront work is essential. It lays the groundwork. But our sources really emphasize this, that initial stage is like stretching before a marathon. It's essential prep, but you have to actually run the race to reach the finish line. All that meticulous planning doesn't inherently change the risks themselves.
It's true. Which brings us right back to our froggy friends. Those 4 frogs, they might have had a crystal clear intention to jump. Maybe they even debated the best way to do it, the perfect angle, the safest landing spot. But until they actually push off that log, nothing changes. And it's that precise transition from deciding on a risk response to actually putting it into action where so many well-intentioned efforts seem to fizzle out.
It's interesting to think about, while the material doesn't go deep into why this gap exists, the underlying reasons why we struggle to take action, those psychological or organizational barriers. The 4 practical steps it outlines actually point to some of those common culprits. Think about it. If nobody is clearly in charge, if there isn't enough support, or if those risk responses are treated like separate afterthoughts, well, that's a recipe for even the best plans to gather dust.
Okay, so let's break down those 4 steps, those concrete strategies for finally motivating those metaphorical frogs to jump. The source material presents these as the keys to transforming good intentions into real-world results, and they're surprisingly actionable. The first one focuses on something pretty fundamental: ownership.
Yeah, agreed, ownership. Sounds simple, but it's absolutely crucial. For each and every risk response that gets identified and planned out, there has to be a specific person or a dedicated team who is not just aware of the plan, but who's directly responsible for seeing it through. Without that clear ownership, the chances of those actions actually happening plummet. It's like, when everyone's responsible for something, no one really feels like it's their job to get it done, and often it just doesn't happen.
Exactly. But when someone feels a real sense of ownership, when they understand that they're the one who's expected to drive this forward, they're way more likely to take action. It's that this is mine to own mentality that seems to make all the difference. And it goes beyond just assigning a name, right? It's about ensuring that person has the authority, the resources, and the understanding to actually make things happen.
Absolutely. So we know who needs to take the leap, but how do we make sure they actually can? And that brings us to the second crucial element: realistic resources. Even with clear ownership and the best intentions in the world, plans can fall apart without the proper support. This means allocating enough time setting realistic deadlines for the tasks involved. It also means ensuring there's enough budget and the right people with the right skills are available to carry out that risk response effectively.
It's like having a detailed blueprint for an amazing building. You know exactly what materials you need, you've got a skilled construction crew ready to go. But then you realize, oops, you haven't actually secured the funding for those materials or the necessary permits. Even the best laid plans will crumble without the practical resources to bring them to life.
And it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about being thoughtful and accurate in allocating those resources. Underestimating how long a task will take or the level of resources needed, well, that can set things up for failure from the very beginning. It's about honesty and realism in assessing what's truly needed to address the risk effectively.
All right, so the third step shifts our focus to where these risk responses actually live. It's not enough for them to just exist in some separate risk management document, a file that might get tucked away and only revisited occasionally. The recommendation here is to actively incorporate these agreed-upon risk responses directly into the main project plan, treating them as new, trackable activities, just like any other task.
That point about integration is key. When risk responses are embedded within the main project plan, they go from being abstract ideas to becoming real tasks with deadlines and dependencies, just like any other deliverable. And this fundamentally changes how they're viewed and managed. Risk management becomes an active, ongoing part of the daily workflow, not just some isolated exercise.
It really does change the mindset, doesn't it? From, okay, we've addressed those risks, to actively managing these risks is a core part of how we do things on this project, and that increased visibility within the project plan, well, it helps make sure those crucial actions don't get accidentally overlooked or pushed aside as the project moves forward and other priorities pop up. You know, it's a really interesting shift in perspective. Treating those risk responses as active tasks, not just passive entries in a risk register, I can see how that would make a huge difference in keeping them top of mind.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the fourth and final step, active monitoring. Just like any other part of a project, you've got to consistently track the progress of these risk responses, regularly review them, and report on them. This ongoing oversight is what ensures accountability and allows for course correction if a particular response isn't working as intended.
Right. It's definitely not a set it and forget it situation.
Right.
Risks can evolve, and the effectiveness of our initial responses can change as circumstances shift. Active monitoring gives us that ongoing visibility to see if our frogs are actually making progress in their jump. And if they're not, we can proactively figure out why and adjust our approach.
Exactly. These regular reviews and reporting mechanisms, they create a crucial feedback loop. Are the individuals or teams responsible for the risk responses actually moving forward? Are the resources we initially allocated enough? Is the risk response actually mitigating the risk like we thought it would? This continuous monitoring is how we ensure our efforts are truly having an impact, and we're not just assuming things are being taken care of.
So bringing it all together, what's the key takeaway here? For me, it's that even the most carefully crafted risk management process, no matter how thorough and insightful, is ultimately useless if it stops at the planning stage. It brings us back to our frog riddle. All the deciding in the world won't change anything unless concrete action is taken.
I love that frog analogy. It's so powerful. If we just decide what could be done about each risk, but don't take the steps to implement those plans, if we don't assign ownership, provide resources, integrate those actions, and monitor progress, well, those frogs are probably going to stay right where they started, chilling on that log.
Yeah.
And our exposure to those risks, it remains unchanged.
It really highlights the fact that it's the active implementation of those risk responses that allows organizations to truly start influencing the risks they face. It's what ultimately allows them to achieve their goals. It's the doing, not just the deciding, that makes all the difference in navigating uncertainty.
So as you're thinking about this, what we've talked about today, think about a situation in your own work or even your personal life where you've made plans, maybe even detailed plans, to address a potential challenge or to reach a specific goal. But then you struggle to actually put those plans into action. Think back to those 4 frog-moving steps: agreed ownership, realistic resources, integration into your main plan, and active monitoring. Which of those, if you applied them more deliberately, do you think would have the biggest impact in tuning your decisions into actual results?
It's about consciously moving beyond just the initial planning stage and embracing the often tougher but ultimately more rewarding work of execution. By really focusing on these 4 steps, we can all get better at ensuring that our good intentions don't just stay as ideas but actually lead to those positive outcomes we're aiming for.